Hi, this is Jaya. In this video, we shall see the summary of Pride and Prejudice, a novel by Jane Austen. Pride and Prejudice is the second novel by Jane Austen and it was published in 1813. The story goes like this. Mr. Bennet, who is the owner of the Longbourn estate in Hertfordshire, has 5 daughters, but his property can only be passed to a male heir. His wife also lacks an inheritance, so his family is facing poor upon his death. Thus, it is imperative that at least one of the daughters marry well to support the others, which is a primary motivation driving the plot of the story. In the early 19th century, the Bennet family lived at the Longbourn estate situated near the village of Maryton in Hertfordshire, England. Mrs. Bennet's greater desire is to marry off her 5 daughters to secure their futures. The arrival of Mr. Bangley, a rich bachelor who rents the neighbouring Netherfield estate, gives her hope that one of her daughters might contract a marriage to the advantage. At a ball, the family is introduced to the Netherfield party, including Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, and Mr. Darcy, his dearest friend. Mr. Bingley's friendly and cheerful manner earns him popularity among the guests. He appears interested in Jane, the eldest Bennet daughter. Mr. Darcy, reputed to be twice as wealthy as Mr. Bingley, is haughty and aloof, causing a decided dislike of him. He declines to dance with Elizabeth, the second eldest Bennet daughter, as she is not handsome enough. Although she jokes about it with her friend, Elizabeth is deeply offended by this. Despite this first impression, Mr. Darcy secretly begins to find himself drawn to Elizabeth as they continue to encounter each other at social events, appreciating her wit and frankness. Mr. Collins, the heir to the Longbourn estate, visits the Bennet family with the intention of finding a wife among the 5 girls under the advice of his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, also revealed to be Mr. Darcy's aunt. He decides to pursue Elizabeth. The Bennet family meets a charming officer, George Wickham, who tells Elizabeth in confidence about Mr. Darcy's unpleasant treatment of him in the past. Elizabeth, who is already blinded by her prejudice towards Mr. Darcy, believes him. Elizabeth dances with Mr. Darcy at a ball, where Mrs. Bennet hints loudly that she expects Jane and Bingley to become engaged. Elizabeth rejects Mr. Collins' marriage proposal to her mother's fury and her father's relief. Mr. Collins subsequently proposes to Charlotte Lucas, a friend of Elizabeth, and Charlotte Lucas accepts his proposal. Having heard Mrs. Bennet's words at the ball and disapproving of the marriage, Mr. Darcy joins Mr. Bingley in a trip to London and, with the help of his sisters, persuades him not to return to Netherfield. A heartbroken Jane visits her aunt and uncle Gardiner in London to raise her spirits, while Elizabeth's hatred for Mr. Darcy grows as she suspects he was responsible for Mr. Bingley's departure. In the spring, Elizabeth visits Charlotte and Mr. Collins in Kent. Elizabeth and her host are invited to Rosings Park, Lady Catherine's home. Mr. Darcy and his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam are also visiting Rosings Park. Fitzwilliam tells Elizabeth how Mr. Darcy recently saved a friend, presumably Mr. Bingley, from an undesirable match. Elizabeth realizes that the prevented engagement was to Jane. Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, declaring his love for her despite her low social connections. She is shocked and she was unaware of Mr. Darcy's interest and rejects him angrily, saying that he is the last person she would ever marry and that she could never love a man who caused her sisters such unhappiness. She further accuses him of treating Wickham unjustly. Mr. Darcy brags about his success in separating Bingley and Jane and sarcastically dismisses accusations regarding Wickham without addressing it. The next day, Mr. Darcy gives Elizabeth a letter explaining that Wickham, who is the son of his late father's steward, had refused the living his father had arranged for him and was instead given money for it. Wickham quickly squandered the money and tried to elope with Darcy's 15-year-old sister Georgiana for her considerable dowry. Mr. Darcy also writes that he separated Jane and Bingley because he believed her to be indifferent to Bingley and because of the lack of property displayed by her family. Elizabeth is ashamed by her family's behavior and her own prejudice against Mr. Darcy. Months later, Elizabeth accompanies the Gardiners on a tour of Derbyshire. They visit Pemberley, which is Darcy's estate. When Mr. Darcy returns unexpectedly, he is exceedingly gracious with Elizabeth and the Gardiners. Elizabeth is surprised by Darcy's behavior and grows fond of him, even coming to regret rejecting his proposal. She receives news that her sister Lydia has run off with Mr. Wickham. She tells Mr. Darcy and then departs in haste. After an agonizing interim, Wickham agrees to marry Lydia. Lydia and Wickham visit the Bennet family at Longbourn, where Lydia tells Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy was at a wedding. Though Mr. Darcy had sworn everyone involved to secrecy, Mrs. Gardiner now feels obliged to inform Elizabeth that he secured the match at great expense and trouble to him. Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy return to Netherfield. Jane accepts Mr. Bingley's proposal. Lady Catherine, having heard rumours that Elizabeth intends to marry Mr. Darcy, visits her and demands she promise never to accept Mr. Darcy's proposal, as she and Darcy's late mother had already planned his marriage to her daughter Annie. Elizabeth refuses and asks the outraged Lady Catherine to leave. Darcy, hearing what happened and understands that Elizabeth has changed her idea towards him, comes and proposes to her, and Elizabeth accepts it, and they have a happy married life hereafter. This is the story of Pride and Prejudice. If you have anything more to add on to what I've said, please write it in the comment box. Like the video, share it with your friends, and if you have not subscribed my channel, please subscribe and support. Thank you.